Hey guys, welcome back. Today what we're actually going to be talking about is classification. Now with this means that we're starting a new unit, so everything that's discussed in this video will not be on your test this Thursday. Alright, your test this Thursday is just over creation and evolution, what we started before this whole ordeal happened and what you guys have continued since last week. And so again, Thursday's test will not include any of this. Alright, this is just a new unit that we're starting, but we will probably have a quiz on this sometime next week, so be prepared for that. So let's just go ahead and get into this. So first of all, what is classification? Why is it important? Why are we talking about it in biology? Well, first of all, we have to kind of step back and retrace our steps. What have we talked about so far in biology? So far in biology, we've talked a lot about the molecular structures. We've talked about how biology works, the chemistry behind it, the DNA, the RNA, the protein synthesis, how our cells get energy, what is a cell. We've talked about the molecular structures. And now we're finally going to be moving on into the structures as a whole. In other words, these different organisms, whether they be big or small. And so in order to understand these organisms and why they are grouped the way they are, for example, maybe why we know that uh, these are both fruits, not vegetables, but they're both fruits and they come from a plant, or that this is an animal, it's a fish. In order for us to be able to figure out what is what, that's through the process of classification. And so if you've done your bell work question for this morning, I asked you guys to just simply define the term taxonomy. What is taxonomy, or what do you think taxonomy is? And again, I wanted you to guess on this. Knowing that we're in science, and you probably thought it was the study of something, maybe the study of taxes, or maybe the study of taxidermy. In other words, how do we make uh, stuffed animals, or like animals that you see in a museum. However, taxonomy is just simply the science of classifying organisms. So again, what is taxonomy? It's the science of classifying organisms into groups. All right. So in other words, like figuring out that birds and sharks are two different things, that's kind of obvious. However, it's a little bit trickier than that. Taxonomy isn't just saying, oh, that's a bird, that's a fish, it's a lot trickier than that. And so why is taxonomy or classification important? Well, to help us figure out why it's important, generally I like to do this exercise with you guys. And if we were in class, I would give you a bunch of buttons to help us figure out why it's important. And so you'd have all these buttons at your table, and what I would tell you to do is to sort them out. Yep, that's it. I would give you just a handful of all these different buttons, and you would have to sort them out. Now, how you sort them out, I would leave that up to you. So let's say maybe I did it by shape. All right, and of course, here we have just a lot of circular buttons, so we're not going to have a lot of groups here. We're going to have like one big group, and maybe here's a little heart button, so that one's going to be in its own group. So shape might not be the best way to classify them, but maybe you're going to do it by the number of little holes that they have for when you're stitching the button on. And that might be a different way to do it, because here we can see there's a button with 2, here's one with 4, another one with 2, another one with 4. So maybe we're going to group the buttons that way. Just a basic one. That way we have 2 very large groups divided by how many holes are in the buttons. So here again we have the 4 and the 2. Now again, you're going to have to use your imagination with me because we don't have the physical buttons here. But assume that we've divided all these buttons into 2 groups. We have the large group of buttons that have the 4 holes and the large group of buttons that have the 2 holes. What I would then ask you to do is to keep both those groups separate, but divide them again. In other words, the buttons that have the 4 holes, I want you to take those separately and divide them. And the buttons that have 2, I want you to take those separately and divide them. Maybe this time you did it by color. And so maybe you're going to have all these different groups. So now, like, let's take these ones for example. Here we have these buttons that have 4 holes. They're all blue, so they'd all be in the same group. Here we have an orange button that has the 4 holes. That's going to be a group of its own. These pink ones that have these 4 holes, they're going to be a group of their own. And you notice our groups are still somewhat large, but they're getting smaller. And so we're classifying them, we're getting them more specific each time. And so eventually then I'd ask you to do it a final and third time where maybe you divide it into size this time. Again, not mixing the groups, but working within those groups. So let's go back to our blue 4-hole buttons here, because that seems like a big group. Here we have, it looks like 1, 2, 3, that one even 4. So at least 4 different sizes of blue buttons with 4 holes. And so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different groups. All right, that all came from that one large group of 4-hole buttons, and those 4-hole buttons came from the large group overall. And so as you can see, when we're classifying things, we get them more and more specific. All right, that's the whole point of classification. And so why is it important? All right, these are buttons. What does this have to do with biology? Well, when we're looking at these buttons, it's a very similar way on how we classify organisms, and the reason for it is very similar too. All right, let's assume I tell you I want a button. All right, if I say I just want a button, there is a lot of different options. Even if I said I want a blue button, there are lots of different options. So if I tell you I want the smallest blue button with only 4 holes in it, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. That's why we classify things in our daily life. It's also why we classify living organisms. So when we're talking to each other, we know what we're talking about. So why is classification important? I'm going to give you 3 basic reasons it's important. Number 1, to better understand the diversity of life itself. All right, you can just say, oh, that's a bird, that's a plant, but we can clearly see that there are different types of birds, and we can clearly see there's different types of plants. Even when it comes down to not so much the molecular, but the small diversities of life, or even in the classroom, you guys have clearly seen how many snakes we have in there. And they're not all the same species of snake. There is diversity in there. In other words, God has created all these organisms with this genetic ability to diversify and adapt to their environments. That's why we look at places like the rainforest and we see so many different animals, and we talk about scientists finding new species of animals and plants every single day just about, or at least that's the general number that they say, the estimate of what should be found each day, because the rainforest just gives this place where life can thrive, and so this life can adapt in different ways. If you've ever been up to my desk and you've looked at the roly-polies or the isopods, I know some of you have, not all of you have, but some of you have seen all the roly-polies and different isopods that I have. You could just classify them all as roly-polies, but they are unique. There's different species of them. And so, again, it helps us better understand just this uniqueness of life that's been created here on Earth. Number 2, it helps us organize the data in a logical manner. In other words, for instance, take the shark and the goldfish. Yes, they are both fish, but they are clearly different. All right, they're also different in the sense of their skeletal structure, where they're going to be found, their size. And so again, sure, they're fish, but you're not going to classify them together as the same type of fish because they are clearly different. And so when I say give me a fish, that's a very broad statement. And so it helps us to be specific, helps us to be logical. And then last but not least, it's going to help us develop accurate nomenclature. All right, I want you to circle this word, highlight this word, underline it, whatever you need to do, because it's an important word that you're going to hear again. It's just a fancy way of saying somebody's name. All right. So when we're talking about accurate nomenclature, in other words, we want a name that is going to specifically describe one organism and one organism only. This type of naming is what's called binomial nomenclature. And that's actually what we're going to discuss tomorrow in tomorrow's video. But for now, you just need to know that this type of system is going to help us develop an accurate nomenclature. And again, why is this important? Well, it all has to deal with the way that organisms used to be classified and how they're classified now. And so what we're going to look at now are the first taxonomists, the first scientists, you could say, who were going around classifying organisms. And again, we're actually going to look to the Bible for our first one, because as Christians, if we take the Word of God as what it is, we believe that actually Adam would have been considered the first taxonomist. Because we read in Genesis 2 that God brought all the animals to Adam and he started to name them all. And again, it says he gave names to all the cattle, the fowl of the air, and every beast in the field. And so it can be thought of as Adam actually being the first taxonomist. Now again, most science textbooks aren't really going to classify Adam as a taxonomist, but at our school and with our beliefs, we would classify him as a taxonomist, even though it doesn't technically say that. Again, taxonomy is the study of how things are classified, and he's clearly classifying all the animals and all the organisms. We could also kind of take this in that other direction of saying that here he's following what's known as the creation mandate, what we talked about, where God gives dominion to the earth, or dominion over the earth to man, telling him to rule over all the beasts of the field and the fowl of the air. And in other words, again, rule over it as God would rule over it, take care of it. And so the first thing he does is go about classifying everything. And again, why is it important to classify it? Well, you need to know how to take care of these animals, just like the animals in our classroom. Clearly, snakes and the snakes and the lizards and the frogs that we have, all the different amphibians, they have different care needs. And so it's important that we understand that they are unique and distinct. So there again, we see another way that taxonomy plays a role in this creation mandate on how we should be taking care of the earth. And so let's say about a few thousand years later after Adam, we're going to come to this other guy, Aristotle, who is sometimes considered the first taxonomist. And so he is considered the first taxonomist because he went around looking at life and he divided it into two main groups. Again, remember our buttons? We first divided it into two broad groups. Likewise, Aristotle's first two broad groups were just that. They were very broad. It was either going to be a plant or an animal. If it was an animal, he looked at where they lived to classify them. And if it was a plant, he classified them based off if they were woody or not. And what I mean by that is when we talk about plants, we'll talk about things known as herbaceous stems or woody stems. Herbaceous stems are going to be the soft, flexible ones. Think of like your herbs and different plants that you might find at Lowe's, the flowers and things like that. Woody stems are going to be things like trees that are going to have a hard stem that's most likely not going to bend. And so, again, when he goes around classifying animals and plants, those are the main characteristics he's going to look at. And so, in other words, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and flies like a duck, it could be a bat, but it's still a bird. What do I mean by that? Well, according to Aristotle here, if it flew in the air, he just called it a bird. All right? So things like butterflies and bats and your macaw here, they would all be considered a bird, or maybe not a bird, but a flying creature. And so all the flying creatures got grouped together. However, we know that bats, birds, and butterflies are clearly distinct organisms, so there has to be some other way of classifying them. And that was really confusing for a lot of people. You do even find this sometimes in the Bible, in certain Levitical passages, it talks about certain unclean animals, and it talks about those animals that are flying. And one of those was actually bats. So again, talking about everything that's going on now, and Levitical law, and we shouldn't eat bats. Yep. So another one would be with the different fish. In other words, if it lived in the ocean, it was a fish. If it was like a octopus here, a fish. A sea star, a fish. A dolphin, a fish. All right. If you know anything about basic biology, you know that those three organisms I just named are not fish, or at least not true fish. Dolphins are mammals. The sea stars, you may not know, they actually are not a starfish. They are what's known as an echinoderm. They belong in the same group as like sand dollars and sea urchins. And our octopus here is actually a mollusk. In other words, it belongs in the same group with snails and slugs and clams. That's a weird group that we're going to be talking about later on. But nonetheless, they are not fish. They may live in the ocean like some fish do, but they are not fish. And so again, this was really confusing to a lot of people, and that's why we needed to develop a better way to classify things. And so this guy came along known as Carl Linnaeus. And for example, Crash Course does a really great video discussing Carl Linnaeus and his order of taxonomy, how he classifies things. And I'll link that video in the description if you want to go watch that. But it talks about how the scientific name of a tomato, for example, during his time, was so long and so confusing that if you ask somebody specifically for a tomato, they might not know what you were talking about. And so Carl Linnaeus was basically like, you know, this is crazy. We need a simplified way to do it. Even scientists like things simple. They like to keep it all simple, or as simple as they can. And so, Carl Linnaeus, who again was born in the 1700s, is known as the father of modern taxonomy because he is the one that would propose this new idea of how to classify organisms in his book known as System Natura, which was published in 1735. So again, look at this timeline here. He was born in 1707, publishes his book in 1735, so he's not even 30 years old yet, and he's already basically putting these ideas out there and making these huge contributions to science. And I just put this quote here because, again, I think it's really interesting the way Linnaeus looked at the world. The earth's creation is the glory of God, as seen from the works of nature by man alone. And this just kind of goes with what we've talked about, how like creation itself, Romans 1:20 talks about how from since the beginning of the world, man's or God's invisible qualities can clearly be seen. And that was what Carl Linnaeus saw within the world. This little guy right here, this is a tokay gecko, and Carl Linnaeus named him, and that's why he's here, and we'll talk about him later. But right now, let's talk about Carl Linnaeus's modern classification system. And so his modern classification system went something like this: kingdom, class, order, family, genus, species, and we'll talk about what this means in a second. But this new classification was a sort of hierarchy. In other words, it went from the broadest being kingdom to the most specific being a species. And so this kingdom here, think of like the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the fungi kingdom. In his day, they didn't have the fungi kingdom because fungi was considered a type of plant still at his time. It wasn't until later with better microscopes and things that we discovered that they were unique from plants, but nonetheless, again, kingdoms were the broadest of categories. This has changed a little bit over time, as we're going to see in a minute, but for the most part, this has stayed the same. And the way he classified these organisms was mainly based on their morphology. And if you don't know what morphology is, in your notes, I want you to write beside this word, uh, it's just their shape and their structure. That's what morphology is that we're talking about. And their reproduction. In other words, how did they reproduce? For instance, think about amphibians. Ampha meaning both. They have that double life. The amphibians have a soft egg that they lay in the water. It hatches, they go through a metamorphosis, and then they can generally live on land. So that was how they reproduced. Reptiles, they have a hard shell that they lay. Same with birds. Think about mammals. Most mammals, unless it's a platypus or an echidna, they're going to be what we call placental. In other words, they're going to develop within the womb and they have live births. And a lot of people did kind of have some issues with this because they thought it uh, somewhat risque, you could say, for the time, discussing the reproduction of these organisms. But nonetheless, that was just the science of it, and it was important to understand. Uh, and it's even important to understand today for genetics and for just trying to produce better crops, better livestock, and whatnot. And here you can see it again. We talked about the broadest kingdom being, or the broadest being kingdom. Now domain. We're going to be looking at what domains are sometime next week. But for now, just know that domain is even broader. In other words, if you remember, we talked about eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. That's going to be our main divisions with domains. And another thing, remember, I've been making y'all learn Latin all year. This is one of those reasons why. If you understand the Latin, you can better understand their scientific names and why you got them, or why they got them. For example, an easy one I can think of off the top of my head, the dinosaur iguanodon. It's Latin basically for iguana tooth, don meaning tooth. And so, again, the Latin, going back to why is classification important, it helps us give accurate nomenclature. Again, helps us with that accuracy in names. All right, so let's take a little bit deeper look at this structure of classification from broad to specific. All right, so this is probably going to be about the end of your notes at number 5, where you have that little triangle on your paper. The top of the triangle is going to be the broadest. That's going to be the kingdom. All right. The next structure on your triangle is going to be what's known as the phylum. This is the one that Carl Linnaeus did not have in his day. This was the one that was developed later on to divide this kingdom again. Because again, classes, for example, these are all mammals. They are clearly different than reptiles. And so we needed some distinctions, not just between the classes and these, but again, reptiles and your invertebrates. All right, let's go with that route. The invertebrates. They are clearly different than everything in this group. And so when we had just, you have kingdom Animalia, it's all these. And then we go to classification of mammals. Well, there need to be one group that is just a little bit broader. So that's where phylum comes in. So again, our triangle, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and last but not least, species. Now, this should sound a little bit familiar to you. You should be familiar with the terms kingdom and species, probably, and maybe with the term family. If you remember when we were watching the Bill Nye versus Ken Ham debate, Ken Ham discussed this idea of what's known as biblical kinds, and he talked about how he thinks that they're at the family level. Later on next week, we'll be going more into that idea and what that means for classification and just other things. But nonetheless, look at your family level for a second. What do we see here? We have a wolf, a dog, a fox, a coyote, and what appears to be a wild dog like a dingo. All right? they are all grouped together in the Canidae family. Again, going back to our Latin, anytime you see DAE at the end, that's going to be the family level. So Canidae is the family. All right. The genus is Canis. In other words, this is the Canis group. Notice who's gone now. It's the fox. And then at the most specific, we have the species. And notice, how many do we have at the species level? Just one. Because again, this whole system was meant to classify things down from as broad as we possibly can be to as specific as we can be. So if we're talking about Canis lupus, we know that we're talking about an animal that's within the Canis genus, that's in family Canidae, that's in the order Carnivora, which would be in the class Mammalia, which would be in phylum Chordata, which means they all got backbones, and then we know that phylum Chordata belongs to kingdom Animalia, which are all these living animals. All right, so again, this is where our notes end off for the day, but just to kind of make sure that we have this idea ingrained in our heads, I want you to look at this and see, try and see which organisms are missing each time we go down this list. So at the kingdom level, we have what appears to be a lot of mammals, we have some birds, we have a butterfly, looks like a lobster or crayfish, we have some bivalves, which are clams, we have jellyfish, corals. Corals are actually an animal. We have our fish and our spiders. Then we go to phylum Chordata, and again, like I mentioned earlier, what's missing? Now we don't have butterflies, we don't have these lobsters, we don't have the bivalves, we don't have jellyfish, we don't have corals, or the arachnids. In other words, phylum Chordata, what do all these have in common? What are the characteristics, the morphology that they have in common? They all have a skeleton. They all have a backbone, or at least a spinal cord. And then we get even more specific. All right, class Mammalia. Well, who is absent from this one? All right, now it looks like our bird is gone. It looks like our alligator and our fish are also gone. What do all these have in common? Well, clearly, most of them, with the exclusion of the porpoise, they are going to have hair in some cases, but it's not going to be as distinct as these ones. But they all have hair, and they are all going to give, for the most part, live birth. Remember, he classified by reproduction. So they're going to give live birth, and their namesake, Mammalia. All right, again, the Latin, we're talking about the mammary glands, what produces milk. All these organisms produce milk, and that's why they're classified together as class Mammalia. All right, so we get even more specific with our mammals now in the orders. All right, we're just specifically looking at one order here. Again, just like the classes and the phylums, there are more classes in phylum Chordata. For example, class Reptilia and class for chondrichthyes, which would be our normal fish, and then we have our cartilaginous fish. They're going to have a class of their own. But look who's also gone now when we're looking at the orders. We don't have our hare, we don't have our bats, we don't have our dolphins, because again, dolphins are what are known as cetaceans. They're going to have their own order. They're not in the order Carnivora. And so I think cetacea might actually be a family. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, we have our order Carnivora. And what do you notice about Carnivora? It includes our wolf and our dogs and all these, but it also includes the cats and the bears. All right, they're all meat eaters. And again, how are they classified? What classifies them? Yes, they are eating meat, but specifically what we look at, the morphology to classify them as Carnivora, is going to be their teeth. All right, these have the canine teeth. same with the family Canidae. They're going to have those canine teeth and more canine-like structures, but nonetheless, these all have sharp teeth that are meant for tearing and eating meat. And if you were to look at their digestive systems, they'd probably have a shorter digestive tract as well, because they're eating more meats than they are, say, plants like a rabbit might be. And they're probably not going to be eating as many insects as maybe a bat might. They're not going to be eating as many leaves as maybe a koala would. And so, again, that's why these are carnivora. All right? And now, again, we've talked about the family, genus, and species level, but let's look at it again. Just the family level. Notice who's gone? It's the bears and the cats, because now we're looking at more specific body structure. All right, overall, their body structure, their planes, and we can clearly see that there is a uniqueness to the Canidae family where it has that dog-like structure. And then, again, we get even more specific into the genus Canis. Foxes themselves do not belong in this group. They are in the family Canidae, but they have their own genus, and so we're left with these. And then last but not least, we have our species, and here we're just looking at the wolf, which is Canis lupus. If we were looking at the dog, it would be, I believe, it's either Canis familiaris or domesticus, one of the two. But nonetheless, it's also going to have that Canis in front of it that we got from the genus. And this right here, that Canis lupus, and this is where we're going to end today, Canis lupus is what's known as its scientific name, or its binomial nomenclature. And we are going to be discussing that tomorrow. So again, this video will not be on our test this week, but you will have a quiz over it next week. So make sure that you're studying for your test on creation and evolution. If you have any questions about creation, evolution, or the test, you can send me that through Remind or bring it to the live stream tomorrow. And if you have any questions about scientific classification, taxonomy, let me know. Send me a message through Remind, and I will talk to you guys later. All right. Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention was you will have to know these levels of classification, but there's a really easy way to remember it. Again, we have domain is the new one, but it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And one easy way to remember that is King Philip came over for good spaghetti, or spaghetti, because somebody touched on my spaghetti. So that's how I've learned it. That's how I've remembered it, is just remembering that mnemonic device. King Philip came over for good spaghetti. And that helped me remember, okay, king, that's kingdom, Philip, phylum, came, class, over, order, for, family, good, genus, and species, or spaghetti, species. That's how I remember that one. Now again, we do have that new classification of domain, but all you do is just take this statement and you turn it into a question. So now it's, did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? And so again, that's just a mnemonic to help you remember what we just discussed. And now I will talk to you guys later. All right.